one more very special guest. Glad to have you here. Mutemwa, hello.
Hello, how's it going?
Yeah, great.
Great to be here.
How do you like the conference so far?
It's been amazing. I've had such a great time meeting different customers, talking about the product I'm a manager of at Microsoft called Azure Machine Configuration.
Yeah.
And just exploring Antwerp. It's such a beautiful city, and it's crazy that people get to meet in different parts of Europe every year.
Yeah, we hear it from your beautiful English. You're from the United States, right? You're working in Seattle in the headquarters?
Yes. So I grew up in Lusaka, Zambia, and then I moved to the USA for school. And then after graduation, I then started working at Microsoft in Seattle.
Many colleagues from the younger generation, I always refer to the first generation, that says in Star Trek, you know.
Yeah.
And
does that include me? Am I young?
And you are third generation, I would say, right? When they came in touch with PowerShell, they actually didn't know much about PowerShell. How was that in your case when you were hired?
Yeah, I think that was definitely the case for me. So I was more familiar with languages like C, Python, you know, sort of more general purpose or like AI sort of focused languages. I think that's kind of more in line with the zeitgeist, I think. And then when I joined Microsoft, that's when I discovered like there was such a huge community using PowerShell specifically for cloud scenarios. And I think that was the first time I had ever encountered PowerShell in such detail. So, yeah.
And now you're working in a very focused thing, Azure.
Yeah.
Azure, everything online is very important.
Yeah.
What is Azure Machine Configuration?
So Azure Machine Configuration is essentially the platform that provides a first-class experience for Microsoft to allow customers to deploy server configurations at scale. So we have customers who are trying to figure out how do I make sure that for the regulatory compliance standards that I have, how do I make sure 50,000 servers, you know, have the same desired state at any given time. And so that's a really difficult task to do if you have to log into every computer and like change the settings manually one by one. But we offer an experience where customers can enforce that across their server fleet. It's available on Windows, Linux, for on-prem machines and for virtual machines and other cloud services as well, like AWS. And so it's a pretty robust reach that we have, and that's like such a huge value add for customers as well. So,
and you delivered a session here, so people should invest in that.
Yeah.
Have you been here? Have you been here before in Belgium?
No, I haven't. When I was younger, I think when I was about 8 years old, I traveled to Copenhagen.
Yeah.
So that's like the closest I've ever been to this part of Europe. So it's nice to kind of experience this place for the first time at 23.
Yeah, there is a great sea between the two nations, between a lot of nations in Europe and one United States of America. How do you feel people here? Is there a difference at all, despite the language?
That's a very good point. I think I would say it hasn't really. I would imagine there are many differences. But I think it's felt a bit similar to me in terms of observing Americans, just because I think Western culture is very distinct from my background as an African person. And so I think just kind of getting adjusted to like the West in and of itself kind of maybe allows Americans and Europeans a bit more closely together than they would if maybe, let's say I was from Canada, for example. I would be able to maybe notice a lot more granular differences. So I think people are very friendly. And I would say Europeans speak so many different languages, it's quite impressive, honestly, to see how one person could know French, Dutch, German, you know, English all at the same time. It's phenomenal. Yeah. And
most important question, were people in the audience curious? What was your impression of the people following your talk?
So I think they were definitely very curious. I think what I appreciated is also how much trust they have in like in the product offerings that Microsoft has. And so customers are more familiar with machine configuration as a platform because of this open source sort of suite of open source library called desired state configuration. It's like a PowerShell sort of innovation, but I also work on the Azure governance team, which has a policy engine where customers can enforce, an Azure resource graph where customers can do an inventory of all their resources in the cloud. And that's not something that's very familiar to a lot of the customers that are here. And so kind of talking about machine config and how much they are familiar with that sort of lended naturally to all these other product offerings in the ecosystem. And it was nice to see that they were very receptive and excited to see all the ways in which just Azure provides a consistent experience for management with speed and control, for sure. So
a little bit more technical, Azure Machine Configuration. Rumors say that has got something to do with desired state configuration, and Gail, the main organizer of this event, he's a big fan of it. Can you deep dive a little bit into Azure Machine Configuration for those who know?
Yeah. No, I'm more than happy to do so. So, desired state configuration is an open source PowerShell module kind of thing. That's the best way I can describe it, where essentially customers can create configuration files that describe the states of settings that they want for their machine. So for example, some customers use it to configure registry settings. Some customers use it to check for the presence of a file on the machine. So if you're on Linux and you have like a file with certain settings, and you want to first of all check if the file is present and basically check the contents of the file, then you would use desired state configuration as a way of describing that. And so many different people have come together to create different versions of the settings that customers can use to apply. And so it kind of begs the question, since it's it's some tooling that is enabled in PowerShell, right? Meant specifically to configure settings on devices and machines. What is Microsoft's way of allowing customers to deploy those settings at scale? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of how machine configuration comes in. Is we are very heavily integrated in Azure's management ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So for those of us who are familiar with Azure Policy, which is an enforcement engine, and Azure Resource Graph that provides an inventory of different resources. Essentially, we combine those capabilities with Azure Machine Configuration for customers to create policies on certain settings and say, I would like my devices to all be in this time zone. Deploy that really quickly across 50,000 servers and use policy to enforce that, and for Azure Resource Graph to be able to check the compliance state of all those resources, which is really powerful if you think about it. And, another cool thing about the Azure ecosystem is we sort of leapfrog on top of each other. And so another cool product offering is the Azure Arc agent, mm-hmm. which customers can install on their on-prem machines or on machines that are outside of Azure, and sort of bring them in and apply machine config then on top of those resources. So it's just such a powerful product, machine configuration, to enable customers to deploy settings at scale, and sort of enforce and do inventory on those specific settings. It's such a beautiful architecture, and I'm happy to be championing our product here today.
There are two main aspects. The one thing is the server side and the client side. We will talk about that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But first of all, if I go back and forth in time, there was desired state configuration number 1, mm-hmm, number 2, mm-hmm. number 3. Yeah. So to cut it short, and my wish, if you like, discuss that a little bit more in detail as far as your product is concerned. Yes. Desired configuration number 1 started in PowerShell 4 by Bruce Payette, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. and got evolved into version 2, and now the future version just shows up. DC version 3. We have a talk about that Steve Lee provided. It can be a bit confusing what is used in which environment. How is it in your case?
So I think currently today we support desired state configuration version 2, and customers have been using those to configure settings across all their resources using PowerShell specifically. And we've gotten a lot of feedback over time. I think this is also sort of a natural development from the direction that the PowerShell team is sort of thinking about moving the product into a a place where customers can create configurations in their programming language that's desired. I mean, I'm pro PowerShell, but perhaps, some customers would like to configure this in, Go or like Python or YAML files, for example. And so kind of giving them the flexibility to do so, I think, is one of the biggest value adds. And, so we're really sort of excited to see, we're always leaning in on whatever ways customers are, implementing their configuration. We've got such a strong partnership with the desired state configuration team and the PowerShell team overall. And so there's always a great collaboration that we do to sort of onboard to all the new changes that come with these features, for sure.
How do you think about implementing these CV3? Is that, from your perspective, something on the long run, or a little bit shorter in time? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think for now we're sort of trying to really give the PowerShell team room to sort of develop it beyond the beta phase before we sort of start thinking about use cases for machine config. And, we're such a customer-driven product. And so essentially we just do whatever our customers, intend to do. And so if, for example, as the product begins to roll out and customers begin to onboard, and we see a lot of, sort of really great use cases coming up, then that gives us very clear feedback on what scenarios we should prioritize. So it's definitely purely from, what's the best way to support the PowerShell team's scenarios that are really relevant for our customers in our service. So from that perspective, we're all in and sort of thinking about, what's top priority for customers as DSC v3 continues to enter general availability.
So it's more focused, to be honest, on the long run. It has to mature. Your integration has to mature, and we will see in a year and two
and
what's going on.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even necessarily say it's in the long run. I think it's more so just, I guess, what's appropriate based on where the PowerShell team feels they're sort of ready for us to start onboarding. So we have a sync where if there are any asks from our end that we would like them to consider in their development, we sort of pass that along. But I think we just want to make sure that it's at a place where we can sort of give an official stamp of approval, and we're not deploying, let's say, configurations at scale before the PowerShell team feels it's even ready for that sort of high level sort of deployment, I think, if that makes sense. So it's as soon as they feel they're good to go. So if today is sort of the day for that, then we're all in, for sure.
From your perspective, how steep is the learning curve? Because desired state configuration is definitely different than PowerShell.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that it might be part of PowerShell, but it's different.
Yeah. So I would say the learning curve is pretty steep. On one hand, I was learning desired state configuration while learning PowerShell for the first time. So I think there's that sort of hurdle there. I think the second thing is it's an open source sort of language. And so it's very difficult to find exactly what you need and what the industry standard is for there's so many people have their own version of searching for a resource to configure a registry setting. And so finding the right one and the most the best official community standard is kind of difficult to sift through. And then I think the learning curve is even steeper if you're sort of thinking about making your own DSC resource. So if you want to create your own get, set, test sort of resource and then enable that within your environment, I think it's even a steeper. But I think for most times, I think most customers are willing to use community resources because it's so robust. It's hard to think of something that isn't available yet. And so I think if you already know PowerShell, then it feels like a natural progression from that point onwards. So
the fun thing, the interesting and easy part is that once you got everything up and running, the configurations itself can be done by anyone.
Yeah.
You don't even need to be a technician. So because most of you will know, but for those who don't, the name is telling, you simply describe something that you want to do. Then you could say something like, I want Windows to be activated. So for on-premise environments. And you don't care about how is that done behind the scenes with SLMGR, VPS. Well, I don't know. It doesn't matter. I want it to be activated, or I want it to have that IP address. And you do not fiddle around with setnet IP address or something like that. But you need the DSC resources. And what you will not know, what you cannot know, is that years ago, maybe 2018, I asked Jeffrey Snover what he thinks about the following question. The DC resources, who will provide these DC resources? And I asked him, wouldn't it make sense if the SQL Server guys provide DSC resources for SQL Server and the Exchange guys provide DSC resources for the Exchange Server? And his answer in short was, but then they have to do it. And the long answer is, and we can't wait forever. So that is the reason why the DSC resources come very, very often developed by the community. What is your perspective on that? We have that little bit weird mix sometimes between community-driven things. We don't charge for anything, but we spend a lot of time on that. And then Microsoft eats up all the resources and they charge a lot of money. So how do you think about that? Is that the normal way how things are going today, and that's the only way we can do it?
So that's a very great question. I think there's sort of two parts to it. Is basically how do we ensure that we're providing support for our customers who are sort of interested in having first-class experiences from the Azure side. And then I think the second is like, how do we sort of navigate cost management as part of the use cases? So I think for the first part, the great thing is that there are there's interest for us to provide first-class support, not only for, customers who are sort of thinking about how long will this be adopted and that sort of thing, but also for non-technical personas, right? Because you said, you put it very correctly that some customers are probably just interested in having desired state work somehow and maybe not too much of a custom experience. And so we have built-in policies, essentially, that from the ground up are sort of built on top of DSC resources that are deployed at scale. And so for customers who maybe don't even use the command line and access our experience from like a portal perspective, we leverage, tried and tested like community resources that, are actively being maintained. And so we just sort of build policies on top of that. And that sort of shows how, I guess, strong the community is. I think we're in a position where we can kind of leverage the collaboration to sort of think of how can we just support this from the perspective of we want to make sure that our agent can easily implement these changes and we support all the properties that these specific community resources provide. Then that's sort of the angle we do. We also do have some open source DSC resources that we publish. So we have our NX tools library of DSC resources that provides quite a robust set of scenarios for server configuration for customers who are seeking Linux. And we, actively address, any bugs that sort of come up with our implementation of that. So that's some flavor of how we sort of implement first party support. But the community does a lot of the work already, and so we build policies on top of that are built in. I think the second thing from a cost perspective is it's actually a good thing then that DSC is open source, because if we think about from an engineering perspective, what goes into maintaining those resources, if desired state configuration was something that wasn't open source or actively, sort of maybe maintained by the community as opposed to Microsoft, there would be some form of funding attached to it and that sort of thing. And so, I don't know what exactly that looks like, but I think it's pretty good that we kind of stay away from being the overlords in the in the open source community. And at least for customers who are deploying the configurations on Azure virtual machines, there's actually no cost attached to management services. So if you're thinking about using Policy and Machine Config, Azure Resource Graph, all those services are free. And if customers are thinking of deploying these on their on-prem or other cloud sort of scenarios, then we have a $6 per server fee for the Arc agent sort of ecosystem that then comes with machine config inside. And, I've heard different ranges of opinions on, how much, how much is $6 worth. And I can't, dictate whether or not that would be too much. It depends on the kind of company and what you feel is worth the cost. But I can definitely say from a price point, it's extremely competitive compared to other sort of server configuration management tooling that I've heard some that go up to $50 per server. And so $6 per server feels, pretty reasonable on our journey to sort of figure out how we can best provide an affordable experience to customers.
Yeah. If you talk about Azure Arc, it's obvious that you talk about Windows Server.
Yeah.
Do you also address other kind of operating system? Linux server is the only thing that is really important. Is that also addressed by DSC,
yes.
Azure Machine Configuration?
Yeah, so we have such a wide, robust array of DSC, Linux distros that we support. So, if you're thinking about Red Hat, if you're thinking about SUSE Linux, Ubuntu, like we have, Debian, we have such a wide variety of support. So it's not something that's like exclusively Windows, and we're always thinking about, sort of providing support for newer, more popular distros that are provided by the Azure Compute team as like first class experiences. And we also try to achieve parity wherever possible with whatever Arc is able to be deployed in. So if the Arc agent functions well on a specific type of virtual machine, then there's a pretty good chance machine config works on it as well. Yeah.
Final chapter. There is another product also built upon DSC V2, that is WinGet, the WinGet configuration stuff. And now we reach out to Windows clients operating systems. And then I think about Intune policies, and naively, I would expect that it's the same, but I guess it's not so, right? What is your point about what is if I target client operating systems and I want the same thing? Let's say I want an activated Windows. That you don't touch that, right? How is that?
So I would imagine our service would be able to function on client-side machines. I don't think, though, most customers onboard to our platform to tackle client-side scenarios. I think they're more sort of thinking about server configuration management from like a machine sort of like purely infrastructure level approach. At least that's what we've seen as a popular use case. And the great thing about, sort of the Microsoft product ecosystem is we've got, people who are honed in on like specific sort of experiences. So there are some products that are like, more targeted towards like client side facing services. And, as a product manager, I'm all committed to whatever's best for the customer. But definitely we can vouch for, our scenarios, regarding server configuration as like just such a very tried and true sort of, approach that's just received such widely popular adoption from customers that before we think of anything else, I can just think like servers are just always going to be, from what it seems to me, the top priority for the customers that we deal with.
But it's fair to say that from an experienced customers using on-prem versions for 15 years, it can be a little bit confusing because somehow what you do from a customer's perspective is might be comparable with group policy. Yeah. Despite the fact that, of course, if you have a narrow look, it's totally different from the technology perspective, but it solves, in many cases, the same problems. Yeah. And group policy works for clients and servers. Of course, it's not the same, different cup of tea, but it's tea. So, and now you split it up, and the client side works with Intune policy that is different technology. That's a bit confusing, right? That's fair to say.
No, for sure. So we've definitely, we're really excited about, sort of enabling a lot of group policy sort of experiences for our customers, in machine configuration. So, we're actively we're about to start, validation for a lot of the, sort of the features we want to enable for customers who are sort of thinking about shifting from on-prem, where they're managing their server fleet today using group policy, Active Directory, and sort of thinking about, is there a solution that allows me to implement this in the cloud that's also idempotent, where I don't have to deal with the, conflict resolution issues and all those kinds of things that come with hierarchies, and sort of thinking about, how do I apply my compliance across my servers in a way that, leverages Azure subscription groups and resource groups and all the other cloud native approaches to sort of manage my on-prem fleet as well. So,
very short explanation, if possible.
Yeah.
You mentioned Azure governance, that you feel home at that technology.
Yes.
What's the connection, if there is something or a comparison?
So Machine Config is actually part of the governance ecosystem. So we have management groups as well, which is sort of like a hierarchy of resources that helps you organize. We've got tags, Azure Blueprint, Azure Lighthouse. So Machine Config falls nicely into all of this. And basically, as a one-line sort of explanation about what the governance ecosystem does is, we provide an experience for customers to effectively manage their Azure resources with speed and control. And why speed and control matters is because, for customers who are heavily involved in Azure, which a lot of our customers, they are managing such diverse resource landscapes with many resources of each type at the same time. And so being able to sort of have an ecosystem that enables you to control all of those very quickly and have enforcement capabilities, inventory, sort of change tracking detection across those resources just provides an easy management experience for different teams. And the cool thing is it's all unified by one sort of standardized API. And so learning how to, do management on one resource sort of translates nicely to learning management for other kinds of resources and enforcing policies on them and that sort of thing. So it's such a beautiful architecture thing. Every time I work at Microsoft, I hear so many customers dealing with different cloud providers, and that's sort of their biggest pain point is, how do we have a uniformly consistent way of having control at scale, for sure. So
fingers crossed that this will work out in the future. That would be a big improvement.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's it. Be realistic.
Yeah.
Final question. Maybe not so serious. When did you hear the first time the term idempotency?
Idempotency.
Do you remember that?
I 100% remember that. So it was for the most popular computer science class at my university. It's Computer Science 333. It's on creating web apps and mobile applications. And it's taught by this professor. His name is Robert Dondero. And that was like one of the first things we learned in the class. Is he was like, some applications require functions to be idempotent. And he was like, idempotency is like, yeah. And so, I didn't really think it was such a big deal, I guess, because I was like, oh, it's just like another fancy word. But yeah, it's like, essentially idempotency is like making sure that for whenever a function in a computer science language, to put it at the most basic level, is called, the result should always produce the same output for the same input. Yeah.
Will you return next year?
Yeah, hopefully. I'm really excited. And if I'm not, I'm also happy to see someone else sort of get to experience this. Is it public information where the next location will be?
We don't know. So it is. No, we do not know. So that is public.
Sounds good. Sounds good. If anyone is looking for suggestions.
In Europe, I guess.
It'll be in Europe. Oh my gosh, mind blowing. I wouldn't have guessed.
That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. No, but I'm so excited. I'm excited to, if I get to be back, I'm excited to be back. If someone else from my team, I definitely know my team will be here for sure. Will it be me specifically? Hopefully.
I think so.
Yeah.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Thank you.
It was great. I really loved, being here, and it's just a great place to be overall. So I'm really excited. Yeah.